what I'm going to do today is talk about the relationship between schools and inequality, and I'm going to make the case that there are some issues going on right now in terms of the opportunity structure in American society. We've probably all heard about growing inequality in American society. There are these challenges to the American dream, growing inequality, and you've probably heard of the Piketty work that's come out. This is just one way of looking at that, looking at the top 10% income share and how over the last 30, 40 years, American society is experiencing a growing disparity between those on the top and the bottom. This is not a new story. You've probably heard this quite a bit. But it's also true, and some people, a lot of people are worried about this, but some people are like, well, okay, we have growing inequality, but that's not so bad as long as we have a fluid system where people can move up and down the ladder. But there are concerns about that, too. The relationship between fathers and sons' income here, it ends up being fairly strong in the United States compared to other countries that we typically think of ourselves as much more open than countries like Denmark, Norway, Finland, these socialists up in Canada. Yet they have much weaker relationships between parents and children's income than does the United States. These patterns, growing inequality, low social mobility relative to other countries, are the concern that I have. And so what I'm trying to think of is how can we improve the opportunity structure for the disadvantaged? And of course, one approach to improving that opportunity structure, one sort of obvious thing that we could do is improve the schools that disadvantaged children attend because, well, obviously they attend much worse schools. So the school-based solution, there have been a couple of different, waves of school-based solutions to this problem with the opportunity structure. These, I would say, are sort of lean toward the progressive side. The liberals like these ideas of making a more equitable distribution of resources across schools. Perhaps you've read Jonathan Kozol's Savage Inequalities, where he describes very unequal resources that go to schools. Reduce classroom size. Just have, a better pupil per teacher ratio. And the Gates Foundation got into this notion of reducing school size and making, small high schools and trying to improve children's opportunities that way. Then there are some different school-based approaches that lean more toward the conservative ideas that are more market-based, greater accountability, No Child Left Behind. Some of the provisions in Race to the Top also fit with that. Weakening teachers' unions. Maybe you saw the film Waiting for Superman, and one of the themes behind that is the teachers' unions are problematic for our children. And really, in the last 5 to 8 years, a focus on improving teachers, attracting better people to the teaching profession, retaining them, making sure kids are exposed to good teachers, and fixing the problem that way. I'm going to make the case today that these are all noble pursuits. These are fine, and continuing to try to improve our schools is worthwhile. However, it's unlikely that this approach is going to make a significant change in the opportunity structure for the students, for disadvantaged children in American society for several reasons. So I'm going to make 3 arguments today about why I don't think it's going to work out that well. And then I'm going to tell you what I think we should do at the end. And I've given this talk a few times over the last year, and when I come home and my wife says, how did the talk go? And I say, well, it went fine. And she says, well, did they like the talk? I think about that. I say, I don't think anybody likes to hear this message. In fact, I don't even like giving this message. If it were up to me, schools would be the way to fix inequality. It would be much easier. This would be the way to go. The story ends up being a somewhat depressing one, but I am going to try to salvage that depression at the end by giving you some hope and steering us in a different direction. So although I'm going to say, yeah, that the wallet is not where that guy is looking on his hands and knees, and I'm going to point in the direction where I think it is, but it's going to be a hard task. It's not going to be easy. The real sources of inequality are going to be more difficult to fix than we currently think through our school-based solutions. The problems with the school-based solution, first of all, if we think about gaps between high and low-income kids in terms of reading and math skills, these are mostly formed prior to kindergarten, prior to formal schooling beginning. Here's a graph that James Heckman, the economist at University of Chicago, shows. And it shows that, this is the relationship between children's cognitive skills and their mother's education. So those on the bottom, let me see if I have a pointer on this thing. Yeah, those on the bottom here, this yellow line represent children whose mother has less than a high school education. And those on the top here represent children whose mother is a college graduate. And you see the difference. Those whose mother is a college graduate are doing much better on all of these different assessments of cognitive skills. And at age 18, that gap is pretty large here. It's more than a standard deviation. It's sizable. But what's really interesting about this particular relationship is if you go back in time, then the magnitude of that gap is largely in place at age 3. And for individual kids, it bounces around, but when we look at these group differences, these large group differences, they are mostly formed at an early age prior to when schools have a chance to matter. A New York Times reporter looked at this graph and said, this single graph destroys education policy in the United States for the last 30 years. It is quite a disconcerting pattern. And if you forget everything else I say today, just remember this particular pattern. In fact, if I didn't show you anything else empirically, this should be very troubling in terms of a school-based solution to inequality. One question is, okay, does this kind of pattern, do you see it replicate? Sean Reardon took basically every nationally representative data set available in American society and plotted how the difference between kids whose families are in the 90th percentile of income versus those in the 10th percentile of income, how that gap in their skills changes over time. So we know the kids in the 90th percentile are scoring better than those in the 10th percentile by a little more than a standard deviation. But in these data sets, how does that change? Some of these are longitudinal data sets. How does it change over time? And what you see is this general kind of flat pattern overall. Perhaps the best data set for assessing this question is the Early Childhood Longitudinal Study kindergarten cohort. And here you see what happens is basically there's this flat relationship. The reading gap might increase a little bit. The math gap doesn't seem to increase much at all. Another problem with the school-based approach to this is that SES, or socioeconomic status-based achievement gaps, tend to grow faster when school is out versus in. And we didn't really know this from the typical kind of education data that we have, which is often collected either at one point in time or annually. But we get the sense of this pattern when we look at what's called seasonally collected data that splits children's learning into two parts, the 9 months when they're in school versus the 3 months when they're not. And you get quite a bit of leverage on how schools matter by looking at this comparison. It provides a natural experiment. All children, not all children, most American children, the vast majority of American children are on that kind of school calendar. So looking at how things change when school is in versus out gives us quite a bit of leverage on this particular question. One of the studies I did about a decade ago used the early childhood longitudinal study, and we found that during the summer, when kids weren't in school, low SES kids tended to lose some cognitive skills in math and reading. And you may be familiar with this pattern. Many of you may have heard of summer setback or summer slide, and we found that in our data too. Whereas high SES kids, you know, they either treaded water, maybe about the same, or they gained a little bit. But because there was a disparity during the summer, we would see gaps grow when they weren't in school during the summer months. We also noted that at the beginning of kindergarten, these two groups arrived at kindergarten. They were tested right away, and there was already a very large gap between the two at the beginning of formal schooling there. Now, those two patterns are ones that I think, as a sociologist, those are not that surprising. I would have predicted that the high-income kids are going to learn faster in the summer than the low-income kids. I would have predicted that the high-income, high SES kids are going to start with higher skills than the low-income kids. The pattern that we did not expect, the pattern that you would not anticipate, is what's going on between these two groups when school is in session. Both during kindergarten and first grade, high SES and low SES kids are both learning at about the same rate, which is remarkable, given all the advantages that high SES kids have outside of school and the fact that they're supposed to be going to better schools. They have two advantages, both in and outside of school, and yet they're only learning at about the same rate as low SES kids. The gaps are developing primarily in the summer. Now, what this pattern suggests, and what's really provocative about the implications, is that it looks like schools are compensatory, that schools are reducing the size of the gaps between high and low SES kids that we would observe in a world if there were no schools. So you can imagine what the counterfactual would be. You can see this growing disparity during the summer. Imagine if these kids did not go to school during kindergarten and first grade. The best estimate as to what would happen is their patterns would look like this in the summer, and they would grow farther and farther apart. So the fact that they are in school is really reducing the amount of inequality we would probably observe in their absence. It doesn't mean that schools are compensatory in the absolute sense and that they're making everybody have equal skills. It just means they're compensatory in the relative sense, in that we're better off having schools and having these kids go to school than we are if they don't. Now, this is really a very different conclusion about how schools matter for children than what social scientists often say. And so it's worth thinking about how this might be wrong. There's a couple of patterns. There's a couple of issues. One is ceiling effects. Maybe it's just harder to learn more if you start at a higher place on the scale. Like these high SES kids start at a higher place, so you want to make sure they're not bumping up against a ceiling and having difficulty exhibiting as much growth as the low SES kids. The early childhood longitudinal study took that concern very seriously. And so what they did to try to circumvent that problem is they gave kids a routing test. So kid comes in, they would give them a short, about 10-question routing test. If the kid did really well on that routing test, then that kid would get a form of the long test, the reading or math test, that has a very high ceiling on it, allowing them to score really high. If the kid performs poorly, then they would be routed to a test that would also have a low floor, allowing them to exhibit potentially a very low floor. It appears that the ECLSK did this very successfully because the data do not have the kind of classic characteristics of ceiling effects where you see clusters of people near the top bumping up against that ceiling. The other concern I have with the ceiling effect explanation is you have to apply it real selectively to a seasonal data. If you believe the ceiling effects are really driving the results, you have to say, I'm very concerned with ceiling effects during the time when they're in school. Then, once summer comes, I'm not concerned with them at all. And then I'm going to be reconcerned with them once school starts again. And it becomes very awkward to apply that explanation just selectively. The other question that I think is an important one is, okay, does this replicate? I just showed you, one set of results that we produced from the early childhood longitudinal study. It's a nationally representative sample of about 15 to 20,000 kindergartners who we followed through up till first grade and used that summer in between kindergarten and first grade as leverage. But even so, that's just one summer. It's just one point in time during the educational career. Does this really replicate across the educational career? Do we see this from other researchers too? Most education data isn't collected this way, but there have been a handful of studies that have collected data seasonally. Barbara Hines did it in Atlanta with about 3,000 6th and 7th graders. And in Baltimore, Entwistle and Alexander started the beginning Baltimore study in the early 1980s, and they followed kids from first grade to about 6th grade seasonally. And then there's a study in New Haven by Mernon in 1975, and then our own nationally representative study that we published in 2004. There are differences across these studies in terms of how big the difference is between summer versus school year learning and what the gaps do. For example, in Baltimore, you see the biggest summer setback, and you see the biggest difference between what's going on in the summer and the school year. However, one pattern stands out that is consistent across all of these studies, and that is that the gaps grow faster when school is out versus in. And what that means in terms of schools is that when it comes to understanding inequality, schools are more part of the solution than the problem. It doesn't mean schools are perfect. It just means from this big picture perspective of understanding these achievement gaps, schools are doing more to reduce it than they are to make it larger. Why is this? How can this possibly be? We know that kids from disadvantaged neighborhoods and families go to really lousy schools, right? So how can schools be compensatory? Here's one way that we think about this issue. And that is, there are school environments that vary in terms of their quality. Some good schools, some poor schools. However, kids spend most of their time outside of school, and those non-school environments also vary in quality, but more dramatically so. So there are kids who enjoy excellent homes, there are kids who endure poor homes, and if the variation is like this, where the variation outside of schools is dramatic, and we think it is. We think some kids go home to stable two-parent homes where their medical needs are met, they are well fed, there are educational resources in the home, they have parents reading to them consistently, they enjoy a very good environment that actually reinforces school concepts. But then there are children who go to homes that are unstable. They may fear for their physical safety. They may not have consistent meals. They may have a toothache that goes unattended. These non-school environments vary dramatically. Just as one way to think about this, school environments vary in terms of the financial resources they have. We all know that. Some schools have up to 3 times as much money per pupil as other schools, and that's a pretty sizable difference. It's meaningful. But if you go to the non-school environments, just think of the differences in income inequality and the Bill Gateses of the world versus the rest of us, and how dramatic that inequality is versus the inequality that we see in schools. It doesn't mean that there's not meaningful inequality in schools. It just means that relative to the non-school environment, there's much more variation here. Who lives in a poor home and neighborhood environment could go to a relatively poor school and yet still get a bigger boost from that experience than a kid who lives in an excellent home and goes to a good school. So even though the poor kid in this situation is screwed in both situations, they're better off in the school situation than they are in the non-school. They're between a rock and a hard place, but the rock is worse than the hard place. School is better than the non-school environment in these conditions. So in this way, schools can be unequal, yet still compensatory. What do methodologists, the seasonal method, it produces very provocative findings regarding how schools influence inequality. So what do methodologists say about this? Are they convinced by this? So far, the ones that are talking about seasonal comparison research praise it as an excellent example of a natural experiment. And what I'm not seeing in the literature are criticisms of this method. We have yet to have a serious discussion in the literature of serious criticisms about this particular approach. There are some concerns you could have about the approach, yet right now I think it's dramatically better than the observational approaches that we've been using before. And so those advantages far outweigh the weaknesses. Other challenges to the school-based solution. Here I would say that the distribution of school effectiveness is more equal than what reproductionists, that most people who believe that schools are the engine behind inequality, that the inequality in school quality it's less than what we think. Or a better way to put it is it's not distributed the way that we think. We think that high-income kids are going to schools that are this good, and low-income kids are going to schools that are this good. And that difference is dramatic. And we all know this, if someone was moving to Columbus and they said, well, what are the good schools? We could tell them, go to Upper Arlington, or go to these Worthington schools. Columbus East is not a good school. Don't go there. We would all be able to tell them pretty easily what we think are the good schools and the poor schools. What I would say is, well, it's not so clear, because a school with high test scores, they have high test scores for two reasons. One is what goes on within the school, but the other reason is what goes on outside of the school. We need to separate those confidently before we can tell how much of the school is really mattering here. How different is the quality of schools that advantaged kids go to versus disadvantaged kids? Does Upper Arlington have high test scores because of what's going on inside the classrooms, or does it have high test scores because it happens to serve kids from advantaged backgrounds? Part of the reason I started, questioning this was an article I read a few years ago by Herbert Wahlberg, where Herbert Wahlberg said that the average 18-year-old American has spent just 13% of their waking hours in school. And I remember reading that and, saying out loud, that's wrong, and grabbing a piece of paper and a pencil and a calculator and cranking out my son Nicholas's estimate for how long will that kid have been in school by the time he's 18. And, Nick was like in third grade at the time. I took him to school all the time. I knew how much time he was in school. Kid sleeps 10 hours a night, take that out of the denominator. I cranked this out, and I estimated that Nicholas, by the time he's 18, he will have spent 15% of his time awake in school. And it was a little higher than Wahlberg's estimate. The average is 13%, I guess. I didn't let Nick miss a single day of school. I didn't let him drop out or anything. So that's why it's a little bit higher. But the main point is this, that if we really want to understand how schools matter, we can't pretend that the 85% that kids are outside of schools doesn't matter. You can't just compare schools straight up and pretend that everybody goes home to the same school or the same non-school environment. They go home to very different environments. They're there most of the time. This seems so high, doesn't it? This 85%. But kids only go 180 days a year. They're there less than you think. So the vast majority of their time is outside of school. We need to take that seriously if we want to understand how schools matter. Let me give you an example of the challenge of trying to isolate this school effect. Suppose we wanted to figure out who's a better golf instructor A or B, and so they're both going to teach new golfers how to golf. And they're going to do this over 10 weeks. They're going to get these new golfers every Saturday for a couple of hours, and they're going to train them in golf. And one way to do it would be then after 10 weeks, we're going to test the golfing skills of those in golfer A's group and golfer B's group. And in this situation, golfer A's students are much better golfers than golfer B's. And so we might look at these data and we'd say, oh, golfer A is the better instructor here. Now, that would work fine if that's all there was to it. But the problem is these beginning golfers, they were at different levels of beginning golfing. The beginning golfers that instructor A received were more like advanced beginners. They already knew how to hold the club. They'd been out golfing a few times with their parents. They came in with beginning skills that, yes, they were beginners, but they were much farther along in this whole process than the students that instructor B happened to receive. And this complicates our evaluation of the two instructors now. We might scratch our heads now and look at the data and say, okay, it's not so clear that instructor A is a better instructor now. Maybe what we should do is look at the gains that these kids made, put everybody at 0 at the beginning of the 10-week program and look at how much they improve between the start and the end, and that would be a fairer evaluation of the two instructors. And this is exactly what a lot of value-added approaches to evaluating teachers in schools, this is the approach that they take right now. This is better, right? However, there's another problem, and that is, these kids, they took the golf class every Saturday for a couple hours, but then they'd go home and some of them would golf a little bit during the week, and they'd go practice. They'd go putt a little bit. They'd go with their parents to the driving range and hit some more balls, and their parents would help them a little bit more with their golf. And it turned out, the golfers who were assigned to instructor A, they got a lot more of this additional time practicing outside of instruction than the golfers who were assigned to instructor B. Now, if you look at this, and you are looking at them fairly and trying to evaluate who is really the instructor, now we really are perplexed, and it may not be clear that they're equal. It may be that instructor B is actually better, given what they confronted. There are two issues, then, that we confront when trying to isolate school effects from non-school effects. The first one is these kids arrive at schools with vastly different skills. That's one problem. But then, while they're in school, while they're progressing in school, they go home to very different home environments. Some of those home environments are so good they reinforce school-related concepts. Some of those home environments are so bad they detract from learning. Those are very different conditions, and it's what we run up against when we're trying to isolate school from non-school effects. So how would we do this? Well, it's hard. The best way would be you'd take a bunch of kids and you'd randomly assign some to go to schools and some not to go to school, and then you'd observe how things change between the two groups. But we can't do those kinds of experiments for ethical reasons, and we can't get parents to sign up for that, to have the chance that your kid might not go to school at all. But there's some leverage that we can get by using seasonal comparisons. Here's the approach that we use toward trying to really understand what's the quality of what's going on inside of a school. What we said is that we're going to isolate what we think, what we're going to call a school impact. And the key to figuring out how a school matters is to first figure out what's going on when the kids aren't in school. So we would observe we'd take the kids in a school and we'd observe how fast do they learn when they're not there. And then we would compare that to how much faster they learn once they get in school. If you are into research design, you might recognize this as an example of a crossover design. Medical researchers use this sometime. If they want to know if a drug works, they will observe a patient off the drug for a while. Then they'll put the patient on the treatment, the drug, observe how things change, then take them off and observe how it changes again. And that's exactly the approach we're using here. Is we're observing what happens when they are off treatment, that is, not in school. How do things change once they move to the treatment stage, which is the school period? And really what you want to know is what's the difference between going to school or not. And our estimate of the counterfactual of what their learning rate would have been had they not gone to school is the summer rate. We assume that that's our best estimate of what would have happened had they not gone to school. And then the difference between that summer rate and the school year rate then represents what we think is a better estimate of how the school really impacts children's lives, how it really matters. If we evaluate schools this way, completely changes our ideas about which schools are failing and which are not. I'll show you. In this paper, we first documented the variation in schools in terms of their kids' average reading skills. And we just plotted them along the reading scale here. Some schools scored very poorly on average. Some schools scored really well. And we drew a line identifying the bottom 20% of schools. Those are the ones that are vulnerable to the failing label in most states. And we're going to put a red dot on those so you guys can remember which ones they are. Then we evaluated schools differently. This is just a straight-up achievement score. What are your test scores at one point in time? Then we evaluated them through a growth model of how much did your kids grow during a single academic year. And you'll see that things change, and a lot of these red dots move up above the bar, and now they look like reasonable schools. But once we evaluate them through impact, which we think arguably is a fairer measurement of what's actually going on inside the school, things change even more dramatically. And at this point, about 3 out of 4 schools that would be considered failing via the straight-up no child left behind, if you have low test scores, you're a bad school approach, 3 out of 4 of those schools look pretty good via our impact measure. And 17% of the schools that we would normally consider as pretty good schools here now look like schools that aren't doing enough to challenge their kids. They're receiving kids with high test scores, but they're not moving them forward as much as we think they should. We think, if we're right about this, we think that what it suggests is that we are currently really underestimating the quality of what teachers and administrators are doing with children from disadvantaged backgrounds. That doesn't mean that there aren't bad schools with low test scores. Some schools, they were bad here, they were bad here, and they were bad here. Some schools are just lousy schools almost no matter how you measure them. But a lot of things from the overall picture change in important ways if we evaluate them in a fairer way this way. A lot of these schools right here are really being underestimated. And some of these schools, if we're serious about challenging schools and teachers, some of these schools are getting off the hook with our current systems because we're not appropriately identifying what they are really doing. And they're getting credit for just, happening to serve kids who go home to really good environments. Yeah?
So when you did your impact, your graphic suggested a continuation of the non-school environment throughout school.
Right.
I could presume that may go either way, though, right? But it's not the same experience out of school for the 9 months versus 3 months, and that could be positive or negative.
It's a good question as to exactly how does that non-school environment change once school starts? And does it matter as much? And does it change differentially across high and low SES kids? We have sort of tested it across a few different assumptions of how much of this summer effect should we still assume happens. Should we assume it happens in the same way or not? We also have looked at things like, okay, so there's a gap in what high SES and low SES parents do, like in the summer, in terms of music lessons, for example. And we can see that gap. And we ask the question, okay, does that change once school starts? Does that does the magnitude of the gap change across seasons? One thing we're noting is that under the measures that we can make that kind of comparison for, the SES patterns seem to be about the same across seasons that way. So it suggests to us that how the non-school environment matters during the summer, at least relative, for low and high SES students, doesn't change dramatically, which suggests to us that this current impact measure assumes that summer effect just goes straight.
But to explain my back, kind of some of the genesis of that is you mentioned nutrition, right?
Right.
So the school lunch program, yes or no?
Right. So a school lunch program would reduce that gap, wouldn't it, during the school year kind of thing? Yeah. And that's why we have thought about those kinds of questions and thought, okay, what if you don't assume that line keeps going exactly straight, and tried to test we've done some robustness checks on that. It does change things a little bit in terms of this number. Is it still 74%? But it doesn't change things in terms of your final conclusion, and that is that we would evaluate schools very differently if we move to impact, kind of no matter what assumption we use there. If we're willing to assume that the summer line should be straight or not. So it ends up changing our ideas about schools in important ways. I'm going to skip this graph just to give us a little more time and talk to you a little bit about some research internationally, because we all know even if schools are compensatory in the United States, the schools in America are terrible, right? We get these mediocre test scores all the time, and so clearly that's evidence that the U.S. is not doing very well. And in this study, Joe Mary, a dissertation student at Ohio State, he has found that, okay, he's replicated that pattern, that at age 15, the U.S. is well behind both Australia and Canada. In fact, we are so far behind Canada. We're 0.30 standard deviations behind Canada, and that's about a year's worth of learning. That's quite a bit at age 15. So this just tells the typical pattern. U.S. schools are lousy relative to Canada, and that's usually the explanation that we get. However, what Joe did is he went backwards and looked at the same cohort of kids back to age 4 or 5 before they were in school, and he compared their reading, their vocabulary scores at that age, and found that prior to school, American kids are 0.31 standard deviations. The gap that we have with Canada, it's already there before schools have a chance to matter. What this kind of result suggests to us is that, when these international tests come out and we say, oh, we need to go send teachers to Finland and see how Finland's doing, and we need to send teachers to Japan and see how they're doing, we need to think maybe about these achievement gaps in our scores a little differently. Maybe we need to think about how our infant mortality rate is higher than Canada's, or we have more low birth weight babies, or higher poverty rates, or a larger Gini inequality coefficient. Maybe we need to think broader about these problems that we see reflected in schools, but the source of them may be outside of schools. Maybe we're making some decisions, policy decisions, very differently than these other countries. For example, we're spending less on social welfare expenditures. We're spending less on public health. We have less generous with how difficult it is to be poor in the U.S. Because one of the really interesting things about Joe's study is not only did he find that this gap is already in place before schools start, but that most of the gap is our bottom tail of performers is much lower than Canada's bottom performers. It's that being poor in the U.S. is much harder than it is in Canada. Briefly, beyond math and reading skills, so far I've talked about schools primarily in terms of these outcomes of reading and math. What if maybe schools are compensatory, Doug, in terms of math and reading skills, but maybe in terms of everything else, they're culprits. Maybe they are compensatory for reading and math, but you still want your kid to go to the better school, right? Because they'll be safer. They'll have more AP classes. They'll have access to peers who have more network resources, better guidance counselors. There's a host of other reasons why schools might be reproductive in terms of reproducing inequality rather than compensatory. What I would say to that is maybe. But it would be odd if schools were compensatory for cognitive skills and then the effect reversed completely for other outcomes. Well, why don't we just test this? And what I would say is we don't test it because we lack the methods to confidently isolate school from non-school effects for these other outcomes. Why can we do it for cognitive skills? Because we have scales of cognitive skills that allow us to do this. Take kids who are low at one point in time, other kids who start at a different place on that same scale, and then confidently assess who gains the most over time. In order to do that, you have to have an interval level scale of that concept. We have just gotten to the point where we feel somewhat comfortable that we have those interval level scales for math and reading skills. We do not for other outcomes like kids' network resources or their parents' network resources. So let me give you an example of how I think this might operate. We might think that all these other ways that schools could be reproductive. Let me give you an example of networks. Yes, some schools might provide better network resources in terms of the parents that those kids are exposed to. You go to a certain school and you enjoy, not only does your kid enjoy the good school, but the parents there, their friends' parents have gone to this college and can help you write the application essay, or they work in a law firm and can help you get an internship for the summer. There are good networks and poor networks that you get exposed to via your school experience. However, those are also distributed widely in non-school environments. And so we could have the same kind of thing going on with these non-cognitive kinds of skills, where if we lived in a world without schools, that you can imagine a kid here in a terrible home environment who goes to one of the poorest schools, has a lousy guidance counselor, but at least in a world with schools, they hear about college and they're steered in the direction of financial aid and how to do it. Even though that guidance counselor may not be as good as the one at Upper Arlington, it's way better. A world with schools is way better than a world without them. So I have drifted toward thinking of schools as, in some ways, a policy playground when it comes to seriously addressing the issues of the opportunity structure. It is a great place to kind of fiddle around with different school reforms that have modest effects on the real problems of inequality and opportunity in American society. The economist Hanyashek said, while family inputs to education are indeed extremely important, the differential impacts of schools and teachers receive more attention when viewed from a policy viewpoint. This reflects simply that the characteristics of schools are generally more easily manipulated than what goes on in the family. And I think we have made a decision that schools are okay for us to jump in and manipulate. It's fine. But the non-school environment is not. I was at a conference at Washington, D.C. last year, and I started talking to another economist about this and about seasonal comparisons and how gaps are mostly formed at young ages. And she said, yeah, but we can't do anything about the non-school environment. Well, I think we can, because I don't think we have to have gaps like we do. Does Canada just, are their kids way ahead of ours for genetic reasons? I don't think so. I think it has to do with lots of policy decisions that we have deliberately made that have led us to this point where those on the bottom of society are really disadvantaged and struggle to get beyond that. So here's what I think we should really do. Yes, there are some things. I'm not taking the perspective that schools don't matter or that we couldn't continue to make them better. But the most important thing I would do is increase our exposure to school. Because right now we have an agrarian-based calendar that is out of date with a 21st century economy that depends on more informational skills. And our kids don't go to school enough. 180 days a year is just not enough for this type of economy. Everything that we see in our data suggests that the more they go to school, the better. So Obama's preschool program, yes, that's good. It's not going to resolve the problem, though, because remember we saw those big gaps at age 3? It's going to help, but it's moving in the right direction. Centralized, standardized schools, anything that supports the public school system and moves away from individual schools doing very different things, makes the school experience more common. Now, obviously, I'd like to see this happen along with efficiency improvements. But really, school-based reform is only going to do modest things here. Really, what we need to do is change the distribution of rewards in the broader economy. We're making decisions differently than other countries in terms of things like the minimum wage, tax rates, union laws, access to health care, mortgage deduction, programs like the nurse-family partnership, which seem to be pretty effective and yet would need to be expanded. So in conclusion, I'd say a couple of things. First of all, achievement gaps develop largely independently of schools. They're large before schools even have a chance to matter. Once kids do get to school, schools are the good guys. They are reducing these gaps. They are playing an important compensatory role. Inequality would be much worse without them. And if we want to reduce inequality, if we seriously want to do it, it requires a broader policy approach beyond just school reform. Thank you.